Create obstacle geometry for the gas tank and motor. In this video, we'll create a sketch, use the Edit Model workspace, use Extrude and Combine. In Fusion 360, we want to make sure that we get started with Generative Design Geometry Setup V4. Or if you decided to create your own obstacle for the front of the frame, then you can go ahead and carry on with your own design. Now that we have some obstacles for the frame, we want to make sure that we represent the gas tank and the motor to make sure that the frame doesn't get built into those areas. So let's navigate back to Edit Model, and let's begin creating the gas tank first. To do this, there are a few things that we can keep in mind. Right now, everything that we've created are inside of the bodies folder. We could rename these bodies as preserves or obstacles if we wanted to. We can also create new components inside of here. Keeping in mind that inside of Edit Model, there is no capture position and there are no joints. So anytime we have a component, the components are free to move about in here. You can see that pieces of the shock are easy to move and there's no revert. So we want to make sure that we use undo to put those back in position. And note that the creation of bodies is actually helpful in this case when working inside of Edit Model. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to make sure that we have enough geometry to represent the gas tank, so that way the frame gets built in a manner that makes sense for our design. Keeping in mind that the frame does need to go to the upper shock mount and ultimately it needs to go to a few areas, but we want to make sure that we are able to incorporate the frame that looks similar to the original design. It's just optimized using our generative design study. So let's get started by creating a sketch, and in this case I'm going to use once again the YZ plane. I'm not really concerned with the location of the origin, I just want to start using my sketch line tool. I'm going to begin sketching up here at the front of the frame. I'm going to start a line that starts about where the steering stem is, and if we want to actually snap to this geometry, we can use Escape, and then we can go down to Project Include and select Intersect or Project. Intersect will create a slice through the center of this geometry, and Project will allow us to just bring in one of the edges. Either option will be fine, but in this case, I chose to use Intersect. So starting from that upper position, I'm going to zoom back out. I'm going to simply begin drawing the upper portion of the frame or the lower portion of the gas tank. I'm going to make sure that it comes all the way back and encompasses a little bit of the seat. It doesn't need to match the shape of the gas tank. It just simply needs to encompass this area. I am going to go back and I'm going to add a constraint here to make sure that I do have a tangent constraint. And again, it's really only for visual reference. I'm not concerned with adding complete dimensions for this body, but if you want to, you can select some of the sketch entities and you can lock them in place rather than adding full dimensions. But just note, if you want to make any changes, you will need to go back later on and you'll need to unlock those. By locking them, you can see that we fixed them in place and now we have a representation of the gas tank. Let's finish the sketch and let's select Create and Extrude. I'm going to begin pulling this out and I simply need to make sure that it goes past where our frame is going to be generating. You can see here that we've got some obstacles, so I'm going to come out a little bit farther, which is about 250 millimeters. It's going to be symmetric and it's going to be a new body. We'll say OK, and now we have an area where Fusion 360 knows not to build our frame. I am going to go to Modify, Fillet, and add a fillet on this bottom edge just to round it off with a 100 millimeter fillet and say OK. If we view this from the right hand side, now you can see that we do have an area where the frame is not going to be built because this will be one of our obstacles. But we do need to take care of the rest of the motor. There are a lot of different parts and components for this motor, and it's just simply not feasible for us to select it as an obstacle. There are also a few things that are missing. The throttle bodies for the fuel injection system, the intake or airbox, there are a lot of components that just simply aren't there. So we need to pick and choose areas that we want to make a simplified version and some that we want to simply just select what's there. For example, this cover we could very easily select. However, the clutch cover has a lot of openings and components inside, and that will just complicate the calculations. So looking at the bodies that we have, if we expand the bodies folder, we have the upper mount for the shock, and then we have some hardware for the frame. You can see that the hardware goes through our mounting boss, and then on the back side of the boss, this portion here is the actual frame. So we want to make sure that we represent exactly where these objects need to start, and we make sure that we do have a little bit of space that we can deal with. So it can be difficult for us to select some of this geometry at times. So what I want to do is I'm going to hide some of the geometry. In this case, body 29 and body 30, I'm going to hide those. And I also want to find and hide these portions of the frame. So we'll go into the bodies. So you can see right here that we have rear and front frame lugs on the right-hand side. Now that we have those, we can begin sketching. I'm going to go ahead and select this face and create a sketch. I'm going to use this as the basis for everything. It's important to note that these will not necessarily be at the same position. We want to encompass a lot of the other geometry of the engine to make sure that we are avoiding it. So I'm going to start by using the circle tool at that position and simply draw a large circle. For this side, we'll need to use project, which is P on the keyboard. And then I'll use the circle tool, which is C. And once again, I'll draw a large circle. I'm going to select both of these and I'm going to make them equal. And then I'll give them a dimension by using D on the keyboard. And I'll simply make them 70 millimeters. There's really no rhyme or reason to that value. I simply want to make it large enough that I can begin sketching an obstacle. From here, I'm going to use my line tool. I know that I need to avoid the shock, but I really want to be careful with what I'm putting in here because the shock is really more of a critical feature for designing the rear swing arm. So the frame is going to be coming down and coming up to this lug here. So I want to make sure that my obstacle comes back, up, and allows us to sort of cap off that shock area. And then I need to go up and into the gas tank. Once again, I'm not going to be extremely concerned about dimensioning these. I simply want to have a placeholder to make sure that my frame is going to go around some of these components. So I'm going to come down, noting that I do have an oil cooler here, and likely there's going to be other components inside of the frame. We want to make sure that it builds around these. So I'm going to come down and underneath where the exhaust would come out, noting that the frame is likely not going to build that low, but this does give me an opportunity to help represent these areas. I'm going to come back up to that position and then say OK. I'm going to finish the sketch, and then I'm going to use extrude, and I simply want to select all of these different areas, and even the center is going to be fine. We can select that, zoom out, and then we need to decide how far we're going to take this. So I'm going to bring this all the way in. I'm going to rotate around to the other side. And I want to be careful with how far I go because I don't want to simply cut away everything. So I'm going to bring this back a little bit. And note that I want to go to the back side of my mounting bosses. So I'm going to bring this back, find where the engine starts to come back in. And instead of cut, this is going to be a new body. And instead of distance, I'm going to say to object. I'm going to hold down the left mouse button in this area until I get a face selection option, and then I'm going to bring it up to that face. We'll say OK, and now we've created a new body that is going to allow us to represent some things that we want to avoid. We want the frame to begin coming around this front section, so I'm going to use fillet to add a filleted corner on the front. I'm going to begin dragging this back, make it about 250 millimeters. Then we'll use the plus icon to add a selection set. We're going to add these upper edges and these lower edges here, and we'll add 100 millimeters to it. Notice that this gives us a problem because of this horizontal edge. So in some cases, you might need to do this in 2 steps. For this example, we will need to do it in 2 steps. So I'll simply come back and I'll add that 100 millimeter fillet. You can see now it gives me something nice and smooth for us to wrap the frame around. We're going to say OK, and then we'll go to Modify, Combine, and simply add this and the gas tank together. While they don't strictly need to be added together, there's really no reason why we can't add them together. It just simplifies the selection process. There are some other things that we want to be concerned with, and that's how the frame is going to get attached back here. So once again, I'm going to come in and select fillet. And I'm going to fillet these corners. Might need to rotate this around to select them. And I just want to make sure that this is nice and round, giving us plenty of room to wrap the frame back into here. And then we'll say OK. We're not expecting the frame to go back, but if we did carry it on and include the subframe in the generation, that we want to make sure that we include some of these other areas. But for our purposes, this gives us a nice stopping point for the frame to build up against, and we've got the rounded front section so it can come off of the steering stem, wrap around this, and understand exactly where it needs to build. In terms of other objects that we want to avoid, we are going to be using things like some of these engine covers. So let's finish Edit Model. And let's go back to our obstacle geometry, and we'll select the gas tank. We'll select this engine cover as well. We'll say OK, and we'll see what's left behind. You can see there's some hardware. There's a little bit of a gap or a spacer here for the oil pan. So we can always go back and we can select that as well if it was something that we didn't include in our obstacle geometry. And again, we also want to make sure that we don't build where the shock is. So we want to make sure that we select that upper portion of the shock to make sure that we are avoiding that as well. So now it looks like we've got a couple green spots. We might need to bring them back into visibility by going into our frame and make sure that we bring in those frame lugs to make sure they are visible. But now we've got the green mounting positions, and we've got some obstacles that we could bring back as well going into bodies. Make sure that we bring those back into visibility. We can see exactly where the frame is going to begin to build. If there are any other objects that we want to avoid, these are timing covers. We can select those to make sure that they are included. And this housing here, which is going to be our clutch housing, we can include that as well. But we do want to be careful that we don't select bodies that are too complicated. So again, I'm not going to select the clutch cover housing. I'm not expecting the frame to even try to build out here, so it's not worth including it in the calculations. But at this point, we have quite a good starting point. We have a lot of geometry defined as obstacles, which is exactly what we need to do. We're not considering the design of the frame. We're just simply telling Fusion exactly where the frame needs to be and exactly where it has to avoid. So at this point, let's make sure that we do save this design before moving on.